A few minutes after midnight on the 5th of June, 1968, in a service pantry behind the ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, a 40-year-old woman in a white dress knelt on a concrete floor beside her husband and asked the crowd quietly to give him room. The pantry smelled of steam trays and spilled ice. Robert Kennedy had won the California primary perhaps 20 minutes earlier. Now he lay between a steel counter and an ice machine, with a bullet wound behind his ear, and the woman kneeling over him, Ethel Skakel Kennedy, was carrying their 11th child. The Associated Press wire copy that moved across the country that night recorded the shooting, the arrest of a young man named Sirhan Sirhan, the chaos of the ballroom. What the wire could not record was the decision Ethel Kennedy appeared to make on that pantry floor, somewhere between the moment she knelt and the moment they lifted the stretcher. A decision about what the world would be allowed to see and what it would not. She held to it through a funeral, watched by millions, through the raising of 11 children alone, through the deaths of 2 of those children, through 9 decades of American history, and she carried it, essentially intact, to her grave in the autumn of 2024. We called her the bravest widow in America. We put her on magazine covers, and we told ourselves we knew her. We never asked what the bravery was covering. Stay with me. The truth is stranger. Here is what this hour holds. First, the actual bargain struck in June of 1950 at a church wedding in Greenwich, Connecticut, between a Skakel and a Kennedy, and why that bargain explains everything that followed. Second, the machinery, the touch football, the photo spreads, the 11 children arranged on the lawn at Hickory Hill, and the specific role Ethel played in building a myth that America still lives inside. Third, the 3 great silences of her life. 3 separate moments when she knew something the country did not, and chose each time to say nothing. Fourth, what she did with the 56 years after the pantry, the organization she built in his name, the honor a president hung around her neck at 86, and the question of why, in over half a century, she never once remarried. And fifth, the 2 occasions, one in 2012 and one in 2021, when the silence finally cracked, just wide enough for us to glimpse what had been behind it all along. A note on where this comes from. This channel works from the wire reports, the biographical record, and the published accounts of the people who were in the rooms. Where the record is settled, we will say so plainly. Where it is contested, or where it rests on recollection rather than document, you will hear it framed that way. That distinction matters more in this story than in almost any we have told. Begin, then, not with a Kennedy, but with a Skakel. Ethel was born on the 11th of April, 1928, in Chicago, the 6th of 7 children of George Skakel, a man whose biography reads like a rebuke to the idea that the Kennedys were the only self-invented dynasty in the room. George Skakel had started as a railroad clerk earning $8 a week, and by the 1920s, he had built Great Lakes Carbon Corporation into one of the largest privately held companies in the United States, a coal and petroleum coke empire that made the Skakels, by some measures, wealthier than the Kennedys themselves. His wife, Anne Brannack, a large, loud, ferociously devout Catholic whom everyone called Big Anne, filled the house with priests, rosaries, and the smell of enormous meals. The family moved east to Greenwich, Connecticut, into a great brick Georgian house full of dogs and guns and noise, and the Greenwich neighbors, old money, quiet money, did not quite know what had hit them. The Skakels were, by most accounts, wilder than the Kennedys. Louder, less disciplined, and in some ways less afraid, because they had nothing to prove to anyone. The Kennedy competitiveness was strategic, aimed at acceptance and power. The Skakel version was purer and stranger, recklessness for its own sake, shotguns fired at Christmas ornaments, cars driven at speeds that alarmed even the children inside them. Ethel grew up in the middle of it, riding horses hard enough to win ribbons at Madison Square Garden shows, playing every sport available to her, and practicing a Roman Catholic faith that was not decorative but structural. The kind of faith that organizes a life from the inside, inherited directly from Big Ann, who attended Mass daily, and expected her daughters to do the same. At Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart, a school run by nuns who enforced curfews and white gloves, she roomed with a quiet, watchful girl named Jean Kennedy, and through Jean, in the winter of 1945, on a ski trip to Mont Tremblant in Quebec, she met Jean's older brother, Bobby, a slight, intense, somewhat awkward young man, the seventh Kennedy child, the one his own father, reportedly worried, was the runt of the litter, who did not yet look like anyone's idea of history. By most accounts, Bobby's attention first settled not on Ethel, but on her older sister, Pat, whom he dated, by some tellings, for the better part of 2 years. Ethel waited. She did not wait passively. She made herself indispensable to the family project, throwing herself into Jack Kennedy's 1946 congressional campaign in Boston, ringing doorbells in three-decker neighborhoods for a candidate who was not yet her brother-in-law, out-hustling the actual relatives. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it is the first recorded instance of the pattern that defines her whole life. She saw what she wanted, she understood it would require patience, and she outlasted the situation. On the 17th of June, 1950, they were married at St. Mary's Church in Greenwich, with Jack Kennedy standing as best man, and Ethel Skakel, 22 years old, walked into the most ambitious family in America and did something almost no one who married into that family ever managed. She did not shrink inside it. She out-Kennedy'd the Kennedys. She was more competitive at the touch football, quicker with the needle at the dinner table, more relentless on the campaign trail, and more publicly, fiercely certain of her husband than his own family sometimes seemed to be. Where Jackie Bouvier would later hold herself slightly apart from the Hyannisport scrum, wincing at the bruises, Ethel dove into it, and the family, which respected exactly one currency, paid her in full. The children came almost annually. Kathleen in 1951, then Joe, then Bobby Jr., then David, then Courtney, then Michael, then Carrie, then Christopher, then Max, then Douglas, and on until the household at Hickory Hill, the rambling White House in McLean, Virginia, that Bobby and Ethel bought from Jack and Jackie in 1956, after Jackie, following a stillbirth, could no longer bear the nursery she had decorated there, held 11 of them. The photographers came too, and here is the pivot on which this whole story turns. The pictures were not simply taken of that family. They were, in a real sense, produced by it, and the producer, more often than not, was Ethel. Understand the mechanism, because the mechanism is the secret's outer shell. In the late 1950s, Robert Kennedy made his name as chief counsel to the Senate Rackets Committee, leaning across hearing room tables to trade cold stares with Jimmy Hoffa in exchanges so hostile they became television events, and the reputation that hardened around him was specific and unflattering. The ruthless one, the prosecutor, his brother's hatchet man, the young zealot who had once, briefly, worked for Joseph McCarthy. When Jack ran in 1960, Bobby managed the campaign with a severity that left bruised feelings across the entire Democratic Party. And when the new president made his 35-year-old brother Attorney General of the United States, a position the American National Biography's entry on him traces through those years, the charge of ruthlessness was joined by the charge of nepotism. That was the problem. Hickory Hill was the answer. Through the early 60s, the country was fed a steady diet of it. The seminars Arthur Schlesinger helped organize, where cabinet officers and Supreme Court justices debated philosophy over dinner. The menagerie that included Brumus, an enormous and ill-behaved Newfoundland, and a pet sea lion named Sandy, who eventually escaped the pool and was recovered waddling toward downtown McLean. The children falling out of trees and into swimming pools. The famous evening in 1962, when a fully dressed guest went into the pool at a party, and the story ran in papers nationwide as evidence of the family's irrepressible spirit. The wife was always in the frame, always laughing, always pregnant or holding a baby, always game. Wife and Look bought the spreads. It was charming, and much of it was true, and it was also doing a very specific job. Look at this man's home, the pictures said. Look at his wife's face. No one this loved could be what his enemies say he is. The tableau was the counter-argument to the hearing room stare, and it worked slowly over years, sanding the word ruthless off his public image, until by 1968, crowds in Indiana and Nebraska were reaching for his hands instead of recoiling from them. Ethel understood the assignment perhaps better than anyone in the family, and she performed it with total conviction, because for her it was not entirely a performance. Her certainty about Bobby was real. She believed, with a literalness that startled even the Kennedys, that her husband was simply better than other men, and she said so publicly, constantly. That is what made it work. But performance and truth, run together long enough, become impossible to separate from the outside, which is precisely the point of running them together. And Ethel had already learned by then what she did with the parts of life that did not fit the picture. On the 3rd of October 1955, her parents boarded a company plane, a converted B-26 bomber, bound for the West Coast, and it exploded and crashed near Union City, Oklahoma, killing them both. Ethel was 27, pregnant, and the accounts of the days afterward describe a woman who wept at the funeral mass, and then almost immediately resumed the schedule, the sports, the entertaining, the forward motion. 11 years later, in September 1966, her brother George Jr. died the same way, in another small aircraft, going down in an Idaho canyon on a hunting trip. And within months of that, a Skakel family employee was killed in an accident involving one of her nephew's circle, and the following year George's widow choked to death at her own dinner table. The Skakel losses came like a drumbeat, and each time the record shows the same response: a funeral, a mass, and then forward motion at speed, with the smile fixed in place. Grief, in Ethel Kennedy's practice of it, was not something you expressed. It was something you outran, in public, while settling it privately with God. In the daily masses she never stopped attending. In a transaction the rest of the world was not party to. Remember the woman on the pantry floor, asking the crowd for room. By June of 1968, she had been in training for that floor for 13 years. Now, the three silences. The first begins on the 22nd of November, 1963. Bobby was home that day, eating lunch beside the pool at Hickory Hill, when the phone rang, and the caller was J. Edgar Hoover, a man who despised him, and who delivered the news from Dallas, by the accounts of those present, in a voice so flat it bordered on satisfaction, and then hung up. Ethel was feet away. She watched her husband's hand go to his face, and she was the first person to reach him. The public, in the days that followed, saw a composed attorney general standing near a flag-draped coffin, walking behind the caisson, holding his brother's widow's hand. What the household saw, according to the recollections of people close to the family published in the decade since, was a man who essentially disappeared. He lost weight until his clothes hung on him. He stopped sleeping. He wandered the grounds at night, and he took to wearing his dead brother's clothes, the tweed overcoat, the old bomber jacket, garments visibly too big for him, a detail so painful that the people around him hardly knew where to look. Jackie, herself drowning, gave him a copy of Edith Hamilton's The Greek Way, and he fell into Aeschylus and the Greek tragedians the way other men fall into drink, filling notebooks with lines about pain that falls drop by drop upon the heart, lines he would carry years later onto a flatbed truck in Indianapolis on the night Martin Luther King was killed. For the better part of a year, the accounts suggest Robert Kennedy was somewhere very close to a total collapse, drowning in a grief that was tangled up with something darker, a fear he reportedly voiced to almost no one, that his own hard campaigns as Attorney General against organized crime, against Hoffa, against Castro's Cuba, had somehow called down the violence that killed his brother. That is a species of guilt for which there is no public ritual, and Ethel lived inside that year with it. She managed the house, the children, the visitors, and the man. She filled Hickory Hill with guests because empty rooms were dangerous. She kept the schedule merciless because unstructured hours were worse. And she pressed her particular medicine on him, her unshakable certainty that God's arithmetic was just even when it was unreadable, that Jack was in heaven, and that despair was not grief but a sin against it. Those close to the family have credited her, as much as anyone, with the slow turn that led him to the Senate race in New York in 1964 and back into public life. And in all the years afterward, across every anniversary, every documentary crew, every historian's polite letter, she never once described that year from the inside. Not the overcoat. Not the nights. Not the guilt. Nothing. The most intimate eyewitness to Robert Kennedy's darkest passage simply declined, permanently, to testify. That was the first silence. The second silence is harder to talk about, and we will talk about it the way the evidence deserves, which is carefully. There were whispers about Bobby and other women. There were whispers about all the Kennedy men. An entire literary industry grew up around the whispers, and in the decades since, writers have argued over which whispers about Bobby were substantial and which were gossip wearing a better suit. Some biographers have treated the rumors, including the most famous ones, as credible. Others, including serious historians with full access to the record, have found them thin, noting that Bobby was, by the standards of his family, the homebody, the one who called Ethel from every campaign stop, the one whose idea of a wild night was a seminar and a swim. This channel takes no position the record cannot support, and the record here is genuinely contested. But the silence itself is not contested, and the silence is the point. Ethel Kennedy lived for nearly 6 decades in a country that speculated in print, in best-selling books, on television about her marriage, and she never dignified any of it with a single public word, not a denial, which would have acknowledged the question, not a confession, which would have collapsed the myth, not a lawsuit, which would have created a record, nothing. Compare her for a moment to the other Kennedy wives, because the comparison is instructive. Jackie, 1 week after Dallas, summoned the journalist Theodore White to Hyannisport and dictated the Camelot legend into Life magazine, shaping her version of events through chosen writers for the rest of her life, managing the myth actively, editorially. Joan Kennedy, at the other pole, eventually spoke openly to interviewers about her alcoholism and the pain of her marriage to Ted, choosing candor as her release. Ethel chose a third road, the hardest one, the total blackout, and she walked it so long and so consistently that the speculation eventually starved, because speculation is a fire that needs the oxygen of response, and she never gave it any. Whatever she knew about her own marriage, and she knew everything, she decided the knowledge belonged to 2 people, one of whom was dead. You can call that denial. You can also call it the last form of loyalty available to a widow, the refusal to let the country audit a love it had already decided it owned. The third silence is the pantry, and everything downstream of the pantry. The 1968 campaign lasted 82 days. He declared on the 16th of March in the same Senate caucus room where his brother had declared. He won Indiana, he won Nebraska, he lost Oregon, the first election any Kennedy had ever lost, and on the 4th of June, he won California, the primary that made the nomination genuinely possible. Ethel was beside him on the platform in the embassy ballroom just after midnight when he pushed his hair off his forehead, flashed the victory sign, and said, "So now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there." Then the crowd was too thick to exit the way they had planned, and an aide steered him through the kitchen pantry instead, past the steam tables, past a line of hotel workers waiting to shake his hand, and one of them, a 17-year-old busboy named Juan Romero, had just taken the senator's hand when Sirhan Sirhan stepped forward with a .22 caliber revolver. 8 shots. 5 other people wounded. It took the campaign's giants, the footballer Rosie Greer and the Olympic decathlete Rafer Johnson, along with several others, to wrestle the gun away. And by then, Romero was cradling the senator's head off the concrete, pressing a rosary into his hand, and Ethel, 3 months pregnant, was fighting her way through a screaming crowd to reach her husband. Witnesses describe what she did when she got there, and it is the hinge of this entire story. She did not scream. She knelt, she spoke to him, she stroked his chest, and she turned to the crush of bodies and cameras and asked them quietly to give him room, give him air. In the worst moment a human being can inhabit, her instinct was crowd control. He was carried to Good Samaritan Hospital, where surgeons operated on his brain for nearly 4 hours, and for a day the country waited. And Ethel stayed at the bedside, and at some point in those hours came the decision families make when the machines are all that remains. Robert Kennedy died at 1:44 in the morning on the 6th of June. The funeral mass was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York on the 8th, where Ted Kennedy's voice broke as he asked that his brother be remembered simply as a good and decent man. And then the coffin was placed on a 21-car train for the 226-mile run to Washington. An estimated 1 million Americans lined the tracks, factory workers holding their hats, Little League teams at attention, people standing in rivers to see it pass, and the train ran more than 4 hours late because of them. And in Elizabeth, New Jersey, 2 mourners were killed by a train passing on the adjacent track, grief compounding grief even in transit. Through all of it, Ethel walked the length of the swaying cars, greeting hundreds of passengers one by one, comforting the people who had come to comfort her. He was buried at Arlington that night by candlelight, the first night burial in the cemetery's history. 6 months later, on the 12th of December, 1968, she gave birth to their 11th child, a daughter named Rory, whose father had died before she existed anywhere but inside her mother. Now consider what Ethel Kennedy did not do across the 56 years that followed. She never wrote the memoir, though publishers would have paid millions. She never sat for the tell-all interview, though every anchor of every era asked. She never publicly described the pantry, the hospital, the decision to turn off the machines, the train, any of it. The single most consequential widow of the American 20th century, the woman who knelt on the floor of the assassination itself, left behind no first-person account at all. In an age that turned grief into content, she treated hers as classified, and the country, to its credit and its shame, filled the vacuum with a myth of its own making, the plucky widow, the saint of Hickory Hill, forever frozen in her white dress. We built that portrait because her silence gave us the canvas. She let us. That was the arrangement. So what did she actually do with the 56 years? This is where the story stops being about absence and becomes about construction, because Ethel Kennedy's silence was never passive. It was load-bearing. Within months of the assassination, she had thrown herself into the memorial foundation established in Bobby's name, the organization that operates today as Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, and for the rest of her life she used it as the answer to every question she refused to take. The foundation gave out awards for human rights defenders and for journalism. It sent delegations to dictatorships. It eventually came to be led by her daughter Carrie, and Ethel remained its living center of gravity into her 90s. Ask her about the marriage, and she would show you a human rights award. Ask her about the pantry, and she would show you a delegation of activists. The activism was not ceremonial. She had stood with Cesar Chavez when Bobby flew to Delano to break bread with him at the end of his fast in March of 1968, and she kept faith with the farm workers for decades afterward, showing up in the fields and at the fasts when the cameras had long since moved on. At 90, in 2018, she joined a hunger strike, protesting the separation of migrant families at the border, an old woman declining food on principle, which is about as concise a summary of her operating system as exists. She raised the 11 children at Hickory Hill essentially alone, a task that no honest account can call an unbroken success. The house without Bobby was chaotic, the discipline uneven, the older boys in particular spinning through the 70s in ways the family could not always contain. Her son David carried the heaviest weight of all of them. On the afternoon before the California primary, his father had pulled him out of a Pacific undertow at Malibu, very possibly saving his life. That night, 12 years old, alone in a hotel room, David watched on live television as his father was shot, and by the accounts of those who knew him, he never fully returned from that room. He fought heroin and cocaine through his teens and 20s, in and out of treatment, and on the 25th of April, 1984, he was found dead of a drug overdose in a hotel room in Palm Beach, Florida, 28 years old. In December 1997, her son Michael died on a Colorado mountainside, killed when he struck a tree while playing football on skis at Aspen, 39 years old, and the press folded the death instantly into its running narrative of a Kennedy curse. 2 funerals for 2 of her own children, and after each one, the same protocol she had learned in 1955. The mass, the composure, the forward motion. She campaigned for her sons and her grandchildren as they entered politics. She marched, she lobbied, she showed up, and in November 2014, at the age of 86, she stood in the East Room of the White House while President Obama placed the Presidential Medal of Freedom around her neck, the nation's highest civilian honor, in a ceremony that grouped her with artists and scientists, awarded to a woman whose defining public act was, in the end, endurance. And in all that time, she never remarried. Never, by any account, came close. Consider the contrast. The country could not help but drawl. Jackie, 4 months after the pantry, married Aristotle Onassis and built a second life. Ethel, 40 years old, at her widowing, wealthy, famous, and by every account magnetic, simply closed that door and never touched the handle again. 56 years is longer than most marriages last. She spent them as the widow of one specific man, and when reporters over the decades circled the question of why, she gave them the only answer she ever gave, which was the work and the family and the faith. The deeper answer she filed where she filed everything else. Which brings us to the 2 moments the vault actually opened. The first came in 2012, and the person holding the key was the one human being with unrevocable access, her youngest child. Rory Kennedy, the daughter born 6 months after the assassination, had become an accomplished documentary filmmaker, an Emmy winner with a career built on getting people to say difficult things on camera, and she turned that craft on her own mother for a film titled simply Ethel, which premiered at Sundance and aired on Hotchpo that fall. It remains the closest thing to testimony Ethel ever gave. Hours of an old woman being funny and sharp and evasive in roughly equal measure, joking about pushing guests into the pool, deflecting questions about her interior life with the flat declaration that she was not much for introspection. And near the heart of it sits the exchange the whole film quietly orbits. Rory steers her mother toward June of 1968, toward the night itself, and Ethel simply declines. She waves the subject off, asks to talk about something else, and her face closes like a door. Think about what that scene actually is. A filmmaker whose entire existence began in the shadow of that night, whose father she knows only through footage and other people's stories, asks the only living witness who matters, and the witness, her own mother, who plainly loves her, says no, not angrily. The way you decline a meeting. Her own daughter could not get inside, and Rory, to her credit, left the refusal in the film because the refusal was the truest thing she captured. The second moment came 9 years later, in August 2021, when Sirhan Sirhan had his 16th parole hearing, received for the first time a parole board's recommendation for release, and stood a realistic chance of walking free. The Kennedy children split publicly and painfully. Two of her sons, believing in mercy or doubting the official account of that night, supported his release and said so on the record. And then Ethel, 93 years old, half a century removed from the pantry floor, released a statement in her own name opposing it, writing that the family and the country had suffered an unspeakable loss due to the inhumanity of one man, and that he should not have the opportunity to terrorize again, and appending, in her own shaking handwriting, the plain sentence that he should not be paroled. The governor of California subsequently denied the parole. It was, by our count, the most direct public statement she ever made about the assassination. And notice what it was and was not. It was not memory. It was not disclosure. It contained no detail of the night, no feeling, no scene. She made it not to explain the past, but to close a gate. 2 sentences of daylight in 56 years. Then the vault shut again. Ethel Kennedy died on the 10th of October, 2024, days after suffering a stroke, at the age of 96, having outlived her husband by 56 years, her son David by 40, her son Michael by 27, and nearly everyone who had stood in that ballroom in Los Angeles. So name the secret honestly, because you have earned it by staying this long, and because it is not the secret the title of a lesser video would have promised you. There is no hidden mistress in a safe deposit box, no deathbed confession, no document. The secret Ethel Kennedy buried for 60 years was the private Robert Kennedy himself, the broken man in his dead brother's overcoat, the husband whose marriage was more complicated than the long photographs, the body on the pantry floor, and her own interior life alongside all of it, the grief, the anger, whatever bargaining she did with her God in the small hours. She understood, maybe on that concrete floor, maybe long before, that a myth can only survive if someone guards the door to the room where the real man is kept. She appointed herself that guard, and she never once left her post. And we were her accomplices, all of us, the audience that preferred the portrait, that bought the magazine covers and never pressed for the harder thing underneath because the fairy tale asked less of us. She counted on that. It was perhaps the most accurate read of the American public any Kennedy ever made. And the only person who ever held the key made sure it went into the ground at Arlington, 6 feet from the man it belonged to. If this kind of history is why you're here, the marriages behind the myths told with the lights on, subscribe to Behind the Portrait and leave a like so the next story finds you. There are more portraits, and every one of them has a room behind it.